when Madison Wright fired me in front of the Saudi delegation. She thought she had just erased an outdated employee. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they have finally removed dead weight. She had no idea that the same sentence had just killed a $3.2 billion deal, because my security clearance was the only thing holding it together. My name is Tom Reynolds. I am 52 years old. For 15 years, I protected contracts that most executives in that building could not even read without help. Madison called me outdated. The Pentagon called me essential. Only one of those opinions was about to matter. The room was full of people in expensive suits. There was a tray of untouched coffee going cold near the window, and a young assistant near the door who would not meet my eyes. 2 minutes earlier, I had finished presenting the final infrastructure assessment, the same kind of work I had delivered without a single failure for over a decade. Then Madison stood at the head of the table, folded her hands, and said the words she had clearly rehearsed. "Tom, your position is no longer needed. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. To understand why that one sentence was so dangerous, you have to understand what my job actually was. I was not just another director with a polished title on the door. I was the only person inside Weston and Associates who held Pentagon Level 3 security clearance for Saudi operations. That meant when classified logistics, defense supply chains, or sensitive cross-border approvals got tangled, my name was the one attached to the solution. Not the company name. Mine. For 15 years, I handled the problems that never made it into Madison's polished slide decks. Midnight calls from contacts who did not answer unknown numbers. Emergency clearance reviews that could not wait until morning. Small cultural mistakes that could have insulted a foreign partner and ended a relationship that took years to build. Supply routes that needed approval from people who trusted a handshake more than a contract. Madison saw spreadsheets. I saw landmines, and the company had survived for years because I knew exactly where every one of them was buried. Madison Wright arrived at Weston and Associates 18 months before everything collapsed. She was 34, fresh out of Stanford with an MBA, a flawless resume, and the kind of confidence that only comes from being the chief executive's daughter. The board fell in love with her immediately. To them, she was the future. Young, polished, data-driven, ready to drag the old company into a brighter, faster era. Her mission, on paper, was simple: modernize international operations. But inside her version of progress, there was no room for the things that had kept our defense business alive. Military relationships were old-fashioned. Security protocols were slow. Personal trust with Middle Eastern partners was, in her words, unnecessary overhead. I still remember sitting in her first team meeting, watching slide after slide about automation and efficiency, thinking one thing I did not dare say out loud: you cannot automate trust. You can streamline a lot of things in this world. Trust is not one of them. Our first real clash came about 6 months after she arrived. She had fast-tracked a defense proposal for Qatar and was proudly calling it a breakthrough in speed. The problem was that she had pushed it forward without running it through the proper Pentagon clearance process. To her, the approval steps were just friction. To me, they were the only thing standing between us and a federal investigation. I caught it during a routine security review. Buried inside the document were technical specifications that violated export control regulations, the kind of mistake that can expose American military technology to the wrong hands and turn a business deal into a criminal case. I did not embarrass her. I did not run to the board with it. I stayed late, rebuilt the proposal line by line, corrected the restricted language, routed it through the right channels, and made sure every defense requirement was clean before it ever reached the client. The contract passed without a single problem. Madison smiled through the approval meeting as if her system had worked perfectly. She never asked who fixed it. She never knew how close she had come. A week later, I learned exactly what she thought of me. I was walking past the boardroom with a cup of coffee when I heard her voice through the half-open door. "People like Tom Reynolds are useful," she said, "but they get buried in outdated protocols. We do not need to babysit clients through military bureaucracy. We just need signatures." I stopped in that hallway, one hand still wrapped around the coffee cup, and felt something cold settle in my chest. 15 years of building trust with people who do not forgive careless mistakes. And she had reduced all of it to babysitting. I did not walk in. I did not defend myself. I simply filed that moment away, the way you save a receipt you think you might need later. Because sometimes one sentence tells you exactly who a person is. After that, every meeting with Madison felt like walking through a room strung with tripwires. She pushed for speed. I protected compliance. She wanted automated reports. I kept the Pentagon liaisons close. She talked about scalable systems. I reminded people that in defense logistics, one ignored relationship can shut down an entire route. The worst part was that she never saw the disasters I prevented. She would send out a half-reviewed proposal, and I would catch the restricted language before legal ever laid eyes on it. She would promise an impossible timeline to a foreign partner, and I would quietly make the calls that kept them at the table. She would delete a checkpoint she called redundant, and I would restore it before anyone with real authority noticed it was gone. On paper, Madison was leading the modernization. In reality, I was standing behind the curtain, holding the whole thing together with clearance, experience, and relationships she had decided were obsolete. The breaking point came with a massive Gulf logistics contract worth $1.8 billion over 3 years. Madison decided we should use an automated system to generate the proposal because, in her words, weeks of custom drafting were no longer efficient. The first version looked clean and professional and completely wrong. It checked every technical box. It had no memory, no respect, no understanding of the military partnership behind the deal. To Madison, it was a document. To our Saudi partners, it would have read like an insult. So, I did what I always did. I stayed late, rewrote the sections that mattered, restored the proper acknowledgments, added the right references, and sent it through under her name. We won the contract. Madison took the credit, and I finally understood how invisible I had become. That was the night I stopped trusting goodwill and started trusting records. I did not make a scene. I did not accuse her of stealing credit. Men like me learn early that anger feels good for about 5 minutes, but documentation lasts forever. So I began keeping copies of everything. Every draft I corrected, every compliance warning I sent, every proposal she pushed too fast, every email where I explained why a security step could not be skipped, timestamps, version histories, clearance notes. The quiet evidence of all the disasters that never happened because I caught them first. At the time, it was not revenge. It was protection. After 15 years, I knew how companies behave when something finally goes wrong. The people who take the credit during the victory are always the first to look for someone else to blame during the collapse. And if that day ever came for me, I wanted the truth ready before Madison could rewrite it. By the time the NEOM deal reached its final stage, the numbers were no longer impressive. They were dangerous. $3.2 billion spread across defense logistics, infrastructure development, and joint security operations. Exactly the kind of contract where one careless move could pull in Washington, Riyadh, and every regulator in between. And buried inside that deal was one detail Madison never respected. I was the designated security liaison, not because of my title. Because the Saudi Defense Consortium trusted me personally, And because my Pentagon clearance was written directly into the authentication process, every classified phase required my biometric approval, my clearance verification, and my relationship with Admiral Hassan al-Mansouri. Madison thought I was just another employee she could swap out. In that contract, my name was not decoration. It was the key. A week before the signing, I did what Madison never bothered to do. I read the master contract line by line, all 300 pages of it, including the sections most executives skip because they look like legal wallpaper. That was where I found it. Security Continuity Clause, subsection 14C. If the designated liaison holding Pentagon clearance was removed before the final authentication sequence, the agreement would enter an automatic 24-hour security review. If no equivalent liaison could be verified by Department of Defense oversight within that window, the contract would void itself. No appeal, no extension, no corporate explanation could undo it. I sat back in my chair and read it twice. I did not run to Madison. I did not warn her. Not because I wanted the deal to fail, but because I had learned a long time ago that real leverage is not a threat. Real leverage is knowing exactly where the line is and watching someone arrogant step over it with both feet. On the morning of the signing, Madison took one look at my prepared remarks and frowned like I had handed her a funeral speech. "Too sentimental, Tom," she said. "We need efficiency metrics, deliverable timelines, digital capabilities." Then she handed my materials to Brittany Fitzgerald, her 26-year-old cousin, who had just finished business school and knew almost nothing about defense contracts. Brittany was polite and nervous and completely unprepared for what Madison had just placed in her hands. I watched her flip through my notes, stumbling over military acronyms, asking under her breath what a security clearance actually meant. Madison waved it away as if it were a name tag from a conference. "It is just paperwork," she said. That was the moment I understood she was not only arrogant. She was dangerous. Madison expected me to argue. I could see it in her face. She had braced herself for an old man's wounded pride. Maybe a raised voice. Maybe one desperate speech about loyalty in all my years of service. I gave her none of it. I simply smiled, closed my folder, and slid my notes neatly back into place. 15 years in this business had taught me that the loudest person in any room is usually the one with the least control. Real control is knowing the system better than the person trying to remove you from it. By then, I already knew about the continuity clause. I knew my clearance was tied to the final authentication. I knew the monitoring system would flag my removal the second human resources deleted my access. So I let Madison talk about modernization. I let Brittany rehearse my words as if they belonged to her. And I waited. Because some consequences do not need to be forced. They only need permission to begin. The signing room went quiet the moment Brittany started speaking. She stood beside Madison with my challenge coin display in her hands, reading from my notes like a student forced to present a subject she had never studied. Then she mispronounced a word of respect so badly that two of the Saudi officials glanced at each other before looking down at the table. She stumbled over the military references. She called joint operations, joint cooperations. She presented the challenge coin without explaining the deployment it came from, or the history behind it, or why a man would carry it for 20 years. I watched Admiral al-Mansouri's face the entire time. The warmth left first. Then came that slight tightening around the eyes, the look of an old soldier recognizing disrespect wrapped in ignorance. Madison kept smiling. But every person in that room who understood protocol already knew the deal had started to die. A few minutes later, she leaned toward me with that same polished executive smile. "Tom, could you step outside for a moment?" I already knew what was waiting in the hallway. Janet from Human Resources stood there with a sealed envelope pressed flat against her folder. looking like she would rather be anywhere else on Earth. Madison did not waste time. "This is effective immediately," she said. "We appreciate your service to the company." 15 years. Reduced to one cold sentence. No mention of the contracts I had saved. No mention of the clearance only I carried. No mention of the relationship that had put them all at that table in the first place. Just a rehearsed dismissal, delivered outside a conference room full of people who understood exactly what she was throwing away. Janet quietly asked for my badge and my access cards. I handed them over without a word. Madison watched my face, waiting for the anger. I gave her silence. When I walked back into the conference room to collect my folder, every eye followed me. Madison expected embarrassment, maybe even defeat. But I had spent too many years around military men to give anyone that kind of show. I picked up my briefing folder, straightened my jacket, and looked directly at Admiral Al-Manzouri. Then, in Arabic, I said quietly, "May your decisions today be remembered with honor, my brother." The room froze. Madison did not understand the words, but the Admiral did. He paused, studied my face, and answered in Arabic, "And may yours be as well, until we meet again." That was all I needed. He knew my removal was not my choice. He knew the company had just betrayed the very trust that had brought him to that table. Then I walked out, calm and silent, and let the door close behind me. That night I sat alone, in my apartment overlooking the Potomac, the Pentagon lights glowing across the water like a quiet reminder of everything Madison had never understood. I did not call a lawyer. I did not send a single angry email. I did not beg anyone to reconsider. I just waited. At 47 minutes past 8 that evening, my secure phone buzzed once. The message was encrypted, short, and exactly what I had been expecting. Primary clearance removed. Security Protocol 7 engaged. 24-hour review initiated. There it was. The consequence Madison had triggered with one careless decision. When human resources deleted my access, they had not simply removed an employee from a company database. They had removed the primary security liaison from a classified international defense agreement. Every sensitive operation tied to NEOM was now suspended until the Pentagon could verify an equivalent replacement. And Madison did not have one. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who quietly depended on your work, take a second right now and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because what Madison had done was only beginning to cost her. I set the phone face down on the table, poured one bourbon, and let the silence do the rest of the work. The next morning, Weston and Associates found out what she had really done. By 9:30, the headline was on every financial screen in Washington. Saudi Defense Consortium withdraws from $3.2 billion NEOM agreement, citing security protocol violations. By the time I finished my first cup of coffee, Weston's stock had dropped 8%. 20 minutes later, it was down 12%. Before noon, the slide had become a free fall. Then the press found the clause. Reporters explained it in plain language. Remove the Pentagon-cleared liaison before final authentication, and the entire agreement triggers a mandatory review. If no approved replacement exists, the deal dies. Nobody needed to guess who had been removed. Madison thought she had fired an outdated employee. What she had actually done was pull the security pin on a $3.2 billion contract and set it down gently on her own desk. Then came the video. Someone on the Admiral's team had recorded the signing meeting for their internal records. By lunch, a short clip was moving through defense contractor circles. It showed Brittany standing beside Madison, clutching the challenge coin display, stumbling through terms she did not understand. Every mistake was there, the butchered pronunciation, the confused military references, the moment she presented a deployment coin as if it were a corporate souvenir, the blank look on her face when the delegation expected respect and received a sales pitch instead. within hours. The clip had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times across private contractor channels and industry forums. The captions were merciless. Know your partners. Respect the protocol. Never send a tourist to speak for soldiers. I watched it once from my living room, then closed the laptop. I did not feel joy. I just felt the quiet weight of an old truth. In our world, details are not decoration. Details are survival. By Friday afternoon, Weston's problem was no longer one lost contract. It was reputation damage, and in defense logistics, reputation is not a marketing issue. It is oxygen. Industry publications began attaching the words no contractor ever wants near their name: negligence, oversight, unreliable leadership. The Pentagon quietly froze several of Weston's active projects pending review. Partners who had returned their calls for years suddenly needed more time. Competitors moved fast because blood in the water never stays private in this town. My phone kept buzzing with messages from old colleagues. Is it true they fired you before authentication? Did Madison really replace you with her cousin? Who approved that? I did not answer much. I did not need to. Everyone already understood the same thing. Weston had not just disrespected me. They had proven to the entire industry that they could not be trusted with sensitive work. By Friday evening, Weston's boardroom had turned into a courtroom without a judge. I was not there, but enough people called me afterward that I could picture every second of it. The long table, the nervous executives, the investors watching on screens from 3 different time zones. Richard Wright, Madison's father and the chief executive, trying to explain how a $3.2 billion agreement had collapsed because the only Pentagon-cleared liaison had been escorted out hours before final authentication. His answer was operational restructuring. No one bought it. Then they turned to Madison. Why had she replaced a senior defense logistics director with someone who had no clearance, no military background, and no relationship with the delegation? Madison started talking about efficiency and modernization and scalable communication. The room went silent. Then General Patricia Hayes, one of their biggest defense investors, asked the question that ended the meeting. Do you even know who Admiral Al Manzouri trusted in that room? Madison had no answer. That night, Sarah Martinez, my old assistant, called to tell me what happened after the board adjourned. Her voice was low and careful, like she was still standing too close to the fire. They told Madison to call you herself, Sarah said. Not human resources, not her father, her. I looked at the phone in my hand and almost laughed. After 15 years of treating my work like background noise, suddenly they needed the very man they had walked out with a cardboard box. Madison called at 12 minutes past 7. I let it ring. Then she called again. Then a third time. Each voicemail sounded a little less polished than the one before it. I did not answer. Sometimes power is not raising your voice. Sometimes it is letting people sit in the silence they created. By Monday morning, my phone rang for a very different reason. It was not Madison. It was not Weston. It was a secure courier standing outside my building with an envelope that carried official weight before I even opened it. Heavy paper. Department of Defense letterhead. A meeting request from Admiral Al Mansouri's office for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning, here in Washington. I arrived 15 minutes early at their office on K Street. The place had the kind of quiet confidence that serious money never has to advertise. Polished granite, retired military staff. A silence that felt intentional. They led me into a conference room where the Admiral was waiting with 2 people I knew from years of joint operations, Colonel James Patterson and General Patricia Hayes. The Admiral stood, shook my hand, and looked me straight in the eye. Tom, he said, we would like you to join us as Senior Strategic Advisor for our North American defense operations. The offer was almost too clean to believe. Senior Strategic Advisor. full authority over how American partnerships would be managed. No Madison, no boardroom politics. No executives pretending that military trust could be replaced with a software dashboard. Then came the numbers. A base salary of $285,000 a year. Nearly 3 times what Weston had paid me. A signing bonus of $150,000. Full benefits, expanded clearance support, and a team built around people who actually understood why protocol matters. But the money was not what hit me hardest. What got me was the respect in that room. Nobody asked me to prove why I mattered. Nobody treated my experience like an obstacle to progress. The admiral simply looked at me and said, "We want the man who built the trust, not the company that tried to own it." Then he told me the part Weston would never understand. "We withdrew so quickly because we were testing them," he said. I looked at him and waited. He leaned forward, hands folded on the table. "We needed to know whether Weston valued the person who built the relationship, or whether they believed the relationship belonged to the company name on the building." The room went quiet. For months, Madison had treated trust like a company asset she could transfer or automate, or assign to a younger face with a cleaner resume. The admiral had seen through all of it in a single meeting. The moment they removed me before authentication, they answered his question for him. "They chose the logo," he said, "not the man who earned the trust." That sentence stayed with me longer than the salary, longer than the bonus, longer than the title. Because after 15 years of being treated like replaceable machinery, someone had finally said the truth out loud. Weston's punishment came fast, and it came in the language that government contractors truly fear. The Defense Logistics Agency placed Weston and Associates on the excluded parties list for failing to maintain required security liaison protocols. In plain English, that meant they were no longer trusted for sensitive defense work. Contracts that had taken years to negotiate began disappearing in days. Projected revenue worth more than $8.5 billion over the next 5 years evaporated almost overnight. Competitors moved in quickly, calling the very partners. Madison had tried to impress with her dashboards and her buzzwords. The irony was brutal. She had wanted to prove the company no longer needed people like me. Instead, she proved to every agency, investor, and partner in Washington that Weston could not protect the relationships it depended on to survive. Madison's fall was quieter than people expected, which somehow made it worse. There was no dramatic press conference, no public apology, no headline announcing that the chief executive's daughter had destroyed one of the biggest defense deals in company history. Weston handled it the corporate way. They buried her where she could do the least damage. She was reassigned to Domestic Digital Initiatives, a department name that sounds important until you understand what it really means. No international contracts, no defense clients, no delegations, no protocols, just internal dashboards, harmless software rollouts, and presentations to people who could afford to ignore her mistakes. Her modernization revolution had lasted 18 months. 18 months to dismantle relationships that took 15 years to build, 18 months to confuse speed with wisdom, 18 months to learn that some systems are not outdated because they are old. They are still there because they work. Richard Wright, Madison's father and the chief executive, lasted only 3 more months. For years, people had whispered that Madison's rise was protected by her last name. After Nahum collapsed, those whispers became boardroom evidence. Investors wanted to know why he had allowed his daughter to replace a Pentagon-cleared liaison during the final stage of a $3.2 billion agreement. They wanted to know why loyalty to family had mattered more than loyalty to the company. Richard tried to call it a leadership transition. The board called it early retirement. By then, no speech could repair what had happened. He had trusted his daughter's confidence over my experience, her vocabulary over my relationships, her ambition over the protocols that had kept the company alive. In the end, that choice cost him the chair he had always believed was untouchable. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office with a view of the Washington Monument, working on contracts that made the old NEOM deal look like a warm-up. The difference was not just the salary or the title or the upgraded clearance. It was the room itself. People listened when I explained why a protocol existed. They understood that a single phone call could matter more than a 40-slide deck, and that trust with a foreign partner was not something you could copy and paste into a spreadsheet. For the first time in years, I was not fighting to prove my value to people determined not to see it. I was surrounded by former officers, serious operators, and young analysts smart enough to ask their questions before breaking the things they did not understand. Some mornings I would look out at that monument and think about the conference room where Madison fired me. Then I would go back to work, exactly where I belonged. As for Madison Wright, I heard her name one last time from an old colleague over lunch. She had left Weston quietly and resurfaced at a technology startup in Austin, trying to disrupt food delivery with the same confidence she once brought into defense logistics. I wished her luck, and I meant it more than I expected to. By then, I did not need her failure to feel like justice. Weston had lost the contracts. Her father had lost his chair. Madison had lost the one illusion she had always lived inside. The belief that every room would bend simply because she carried the right last name and the right vocabulary. And me? I had stopped measuring my worth by people who never understood it in the first place. That was the real revenge, not watching her fall, realizing that I no longer cared whether she did. These days, when a younger analyst asks me why I care so much about protocols, I tell them the same thing every time. A rule is not always red tape. Sometimes it is the scar left behind by a disaster that someone else barely survived. Madison thought experience was slow. Weston thought loyalty was replaceable. They learned otherwise when the contracts vanished. The board turned cold, and the people they dismissed became the people everyone else suddenly wanted to call. So, no, the best revenge was never watching Madison fall. The best revenge was realizing I did not need her approval to stand up straight. If this story reminded you that quiet strength always outlasts loud arrogance, do me a favor and subscribe for more stories about betrayal, justice, and the kind of karma that takes its time. And tell me in the comments, if you had been in my place, would you have stayed silent and let the trap close on its own? Or would you have warned them about that clause before walking out the door? Because people may overlook your worth for a while, but the truth always finds its way back into the room.